Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
Most of us open a packet of almonds without wondering too much about how each almond is perfectly whole, that it didn't break while cracking the shell. At least I don't think about such things while having a few almonds in the morning. And I don't even realize that those California almonds might well be deshelled in some home in Delhi by someone like Syeda X. Syeda X is one of the millions of Indians who assemble the little things we take for granted. Shelled almonds, tea strainers, the neatly trimmed ends of jeans. She probably works at home, taking on piecemeal work while raising her family. Her labor makes my daily life possible, but she exists out of sight in her home, in some slum perhaps, doing piecemeal work. Award-winning journalist Neha Dixit tells the story of one such woman over years, and along the way maps a changing India as well. Because though we don't realize it, there is a dotted line connecting the momentous events of Indian history, like the destruction of the Babri Masjid, to that packet of almonds. It's ultimately the story of the unknown Indians who build the India we know. The Many Lives of Syeda X, the story of an unknown Indian. The author, Neha Dixit, joins us on the show. Neha Dixit, welcome to the show.
So happy to be here, Sandip. Really.
Thank you. So first, who is Syeda X?
Syeda X is anyone around us who makes our life possible. Syeda X is a person who makes our door hinges and makes our helmet parts and makes our pressure cooker parts and clean the almonds and the walnut that we eat, or packs the stationery that we use, or the bags or the garments that we use, or any of the games, chess, ludo pieces that she makes, or a person who makes a tea strainer, does weaving for our handloom clothes, or cuts the threads on the denims that we wear. So she is a person who's around us everywhere, but in the last few years where increasingly any focus has been on the privileged and on the urban rich or the middle class, Syeda X is a person who's forgotten, and we no longer notice how much she enables our life.
You say Syeda X is forgotten now because of the way our focus has shifted. But was she ever really visible, or is she indeed a product of an India whose markets opened up when we had the jeans whose threads needed to be cut? At one time, we didn't have those.
So let me just put it this way. Yes, Sandip. Of course, in the book also you see that I have looked at Saida's story in the last 30 years since the markets opened up. But I would say the crucial difference is that before the markets opened up, at least in the popular culture, all our movies or the books that we would read or something that we would see on TV, at least in the popular culture, there was some sort of reference of a person on the margin, but still doing things for us. Since the markets opened in the 90s, there has been more and more corporatization of the media. And this includes not just journalism, but also the films that we make, or even the very popular books that are out, or even in our imaginations, that person is no longer visible. So that is the difference.
And how does it benefit both the powers that be, as well as people like us who are buying those jeans and footballs and things that she's making, to keep the Syeda X's invisible?
Since the markets opened up, a lot of multinational companies also started coming to countries like India in the global south, where there was more surplus of the labor. So what they did was, because our labor laws and everything was not really strict, and we were also inviting multinational companies to come here, what they did was that they started outsourcing this work on a piece rate basis. So Syeda, when I say that she makes helmet parts, she's making those parts at home as a home-based worker, and she is paid per 12 dozen pieces that she makes. So per 144 pieces she makes is how she is paid. So she's not getting a time-based wage, but instead the number of things that she makes, the number of pieces that she makes. And multinational companies wanted somebody like Syeda and have used many women like Syeda to do that. So, for example, if they're making football parts, they are not setting up a factory that has to give minimum wage and has to provide adequate working conditions, but basically they are just paying on the basis of the pieces that they are making. So what happens is that increasingly this has become also the template that the domestic markets now use. So it's no longer limited to multinational companies doing that, but also the domestic markets basically doing that. So what happens is they end up getting products made at a very cheap rate, and the workers do not get adequate minimum wage. For example, Syeda, who is a P-state worker, which is technically called home-based worker, even after working for 12 to 16 hours every day for the last 30 years, has not been able to make more than 1/5 of the daily minimum wage in Delhi.
But we have been sold this idea, Neha, that working from home gives especially women more agency, more flexibility. They don't really have to choose that much between family and home. They don't need permission to go out and work. And I think you have a statistic in the book that shows 82% of working women in India are concentrated in the informal sector. So it's been sold as a win-win for people like Syeda.
Actually, it's only certain type of people who can say that it's a win-win. There's a huge, like a class question here that is applicable. For example, let's just put it this way, that in India, most of the women work in the agricultural sector. And after that, most of the women work as home-based workers, which are P-state workers like Syeda. Now, what happens is that these are people who are not necessarily not wanting to go out and work. Like in the book also, you see, Syeda does try to go and work in a factory, which is, even then when she's going out and working, she's not getting a minimum wage. So there are questions of gender pay gap. There are questions of creating a system where there is no scope to ask for more. Also, so while working on the book for the last 9 years, one realized that, men have a higher sense of self-worth. So which is why all the people that I meet, the men in the family like Syeda, if they do not get 250 rupees per day and a time-based wage, they would sit unemployed the whole day but not take that work up. Women, because they are so desperate and there is all these conditions of caregiving and taking care of the family, which is why if you ask them and you say, why do you do it? Or if you even ask them, are you a worker? And they'll say, no, I'm not a worker. And then you say, no, but you are actually working. I see you working every day. And then they say, no, this is just to buy milk or grocery for the children or pay for the tuition fees. So whatever little coming their way is what they're taking up just to take care of the family. And because the system has been like that, where there has been no regulation and no serious effort to actually do something about home-based cheap female labor economy, that there is also no scope to negotiate, that I will not work for 80 rupees for 12 hours a day, give me more. Home-based work essentially after COVID is what most people understand, right? But this work has continued. So when people say it's a win-win, yes, in some way women, because they do not have the support structure, right? Syeda wants to go out, but there are no creche available, right? There is nobody to take care of those aspects. So which is why there is no other way to survive than to get those pieces at home and make those cycle break wires at home. But for the middle class and upwards, maybe you can say that probably the desperation is not so much, and which is why it could be women. So there's a huge class component that one needs to take into account.
So in these 9 years, as you keep talking to Syeda and getting her story and grappling with these issues that come up where people say, like, no, this is not really work. I don't really have rights. I can't demand. Do you think you might have kind of screwed things up a little bit where someone like Syeda will say, no, actually, I can go and ask for more. I do have rights. This is work.
So, no, Sandip, I don't think it required me to do that, right? They already for some women, again, so Syeda has done this for 30 years. So, and she's been part of a strike also and things have happened. So, which is why she's kind of aware. Delhi as a city, it has a number of small and medium industrial units. As part of the master plan, it was ruled out in Delhi, unlike Kolkata and Bombay, which have like huge industrial units. So here, when 35,000 migrants every day never come and never go back amongst all the people who come to Delhi. These are the women who enter these places, and this is the only work available. So, which is why all the periphery of Delhi, it's full of women doing this work wherever you go. So, for them, because the desperation is so much to be able to get that. And of course, there is patriarchy involved, like you said earlier, also. That in the book, also, I mentioned that some men who don't earn or they start earning, so there is some aspiration and social mobility that is inspired by the upper caste template, that women from good family don't do that. And so, which is why they have to keep that pretense, but also take up work because there is desperate need at home. So, that's definitely there. So, for the women who've already been there, like Syeda, she was part of a strike, and we can talk about it later, where she now, at one point, she was like, okay, I deserve this. And when I made a demand, there were repercussions, but finally someone heard me, compared to the women who joined and who were younger. So no, it didn't need me at all. They didn't need me at all too.
But was Saida like, why are you writing about me? I mean, what's there in my life?
So yeah, great question, because initially when I said I want to write about you, so she's like, "Acha, whatever. What are you going to write about?" And then obviously she was frustrated also. One day I was like dutifully taking notes and saying, "Where all did you work in these 30 years?" And okay, you worked, you made doorknobs, you made cycle brake wires, and then she got really irritated and she said, "I've just done 12 hours of this. Now I have to talk about this also." So that, or the fact that once she took me around, and she was helping me identify some quote unquote factories where she was working. And then she was talking to some women and she said, I translated, she said, "Ye mujh par kitab likh rahi hai." She told some women that she's writing a book on me. And the women were like, what? Like, how is that? What is so? Because it has been so normalized and like it's nothing extraordinary for her. And even when the book came out and I showed her the book, she said that, okay, yeah, okay, whatever. But have you seen this new YouTube thing? Something. She wants to talk about Amitabh Bachchan and Madhuri Dixit and Tezab and all of that. She's like, yeah, okay, book, whatever. But there was curiosity, and also she took her time to trust me. Like, so the bits about work, okay, yeah, okay, anyway, I'll tell you. But bits about her life, which came to me in all possible orders. So she also took her time to trust me and tell me one thing in 2014 and any next thing in 2018, and took 4 years to sort of join the dots together and kind of verify me in her head.
Perhaps her reaction only goes to show, Neha, that contrary to what you and I and this podcast believe, books are not that important to most people. YouTube videos much more important.
And she also, at one point, it was very interesting. I had gone and I was speaking to all the women workers, and then it's so nice. The women workers were speaking to them and they sort of referred to me and said, see, poor thing, she has to go to all kinds of places to do her work. So, they also had a gaze on me, that why was I coming and I was poor thing according to them. So there is all of this happening.
Were there things, you said it took a while for her to trust you and to you, but were there things you think she didn't talk to you about or you felt too uncomfortable to ask?
So, yes, both things. So, Syeda essentially was a weaver in Banaras. And she came to Delhi after her loom was burned down by the PSC when the Babri Masjid demolition happened and there were riots in Banaras. So, that's when she later on...
You should explain what PSC is.
It's the constabulary that works when there are riots and steps in. So, that's what the PSC is. So, when she came to Delhi is when she was in central Delhi, then she was in this Karaval Nagar, northeast Delhi, and several urban villages in Delhi. For her, like I was asking, it was foolish of me also because initially I was asking her questions in a very chronological fashion, like as a journalist, what happened, then who did that, whatever. And then you realize one day, so I had started meeting her towards the end of 2014. By 2018, I was just randomly having group interviews, group discussions, informal discussions, all of that. So my information that I had collected was not organized in a chronological fashion. Till in 2018, I asked her about, okay, what all happened in 2014. And she then told me that she has one more son. So even after knowing her for 4 years, she did not tell me that she had one more son. And then she decided to tell me more about him, and I realized that, okay, Shahzeb was in love with someone, her son, and he had to leave because their lives were at risk because he was in love with a Hindu woman. And so one realized that this whole love jihad conversation has happened and that has kind of troubled their lives. Or something else that once I saw lots of film posters in their house. There were always lots of film posters. And once I started talking about what films she likes and, what all films has she seen. So she did tell me about the fact that, her only condition to get married to a man was that he has to also be interested in films. And she had just seen Tezab by Neha Dixit, and that was like a game changer for her. But she also then started telling me about her father. And till now, because there are all these stigmas that travel across generations and family, so her father, who was also from a weaving family but was not interested in weaving, basically left and joined Gulab Bai's Nautanki. And so singing and dancing, and he had interest in that and all, and he became a tailor eventually in the company. So she hadn't spoken about him because it was sort of not nice to speak about a person who was a weaver and then went and joined Nautanki. And then later on, she says that her interest in films perhaps comes from her father, because her father used to tell her about how sometimes he used to double up as an actor in Nautanki and act as a joker or a vidushak and things like that. So, all this back and forth kept happening throughout my 9 years of meeting her.
Did you have to expose a certain vulnerability to her?
I wouldn't call it deliberate, but when you know someone for 9 years and when you're asking personal questions, when you're meeting them, when you're taking their time, there is a relationship that goes beyond the book or the project or whatever you're working. And so, for example, if I would ask her questions about her life, she would also ask me those questions. And not just for this book, generally in my reporting, I've realized that the only way people speak to you when you also answer the questions. And so that whole thing of, you keep a distance from the source and all that, so for a lot of times, I don't think it has been possible for me. So like throughout 9 years, she's always asked me, or who all are there at home? And you say, no, me, my partner and a cat. And then she said, again? So her question always was, again, why don't you have a child? Again, you don't have a child. Again, so all those things, if somebody asks you outside, you're like, why should I answer this? But the relationship has also developed that way in these years, that it's not exposing vulnerability, but it's also being like close to each other and having like intimate conversations of some sort.
So Neha, were you looking for a Syeda to tell this story, or did a Syeda happen and therefore the story happened?
Syeda happened. If I can rant a little bit, I was very irritated.
Please, it's a podcast. We are all about ranting. You can even use curse words. Even that's okay.
So I was working for a television news channel from 2010 to 2012. And towards the end of my stint there, a big corporate group had bought 37% share in this media house. So the marketing team, along with the editorial team, sat together and we were told for 40 minutes how our target audience is going to be the urban rich. So which meant that the graphics on the screen, all that fire that we see on the screen, everything is for a 35-year-old male techie in Bangalore. And so when he comes back home, he should switch to this channel and he should watch it. And so the bulletin, the content, whatever. And towards those 40 minutes, our editor asked us if there are any questions. And I raised my hand and I said, is there a she? To which this editor in front of 70 people said, scientific research suggests that women do not watch television news, so there is no she. And then they said, and you guys, then he pointed towards my team because I was in the investigations team. They said that you guys, you stop doing these bleeding heart Jhola wala stories. So this farmer suicides and all, whatever, you can't do all that. Because the idea was that if you have to sell like fancy kitchen appliances and modular kitchens in your prime time break, then you can't talk about malnutrition. So you can't mess with the buying mood of the viewer. So I was told, why don't you do investigations on the rich kids racing fast cars in South Delhi? So I had no skill. I have zero skills to do such an investigation. And eventually I left my job. Thankfully, what happened also was that after the 2012 anti-rape movement, there was more space to talk about, I would not say gender, let's say just sexual violence. Because earlier when we would propose those stories, they were dismissed. Now, at least one could do stories on sexual violence. And I started working as a freelancer. And so 2013 and 2014, I did a lot of stories on sexual violence. But for me, I also realized whatever I was writing and reporting and people were reading, I was also doing a very limited job around those stories. So, for example, when the Muzaffarnagar riots happened, and I spoke to several women who had faced sexual violence and also went to the court, some of them. But after filing their cases, they had to come back and work in the fields of the same accused people. And so one realized that we are also doing very episodic, I was also doing very episodic reporting around these people. And so they are farm workers and they're facing sexual violence. They go looking for justice, but again, they have to come back to that same reality. And there were similar, many of those stories. I'd done a story on one Adivasi woman from Mirzapur who used to work in a stone quarry. And she had faced sexual violence and she was pregnant because of that incident. And she couldn't take 2 days off from work to get an abortion done. And as a result, she had to carry the child. So there were all these stories. So I was also realized that, women as people, as citizens are now in the media, gender violence, sexual violence in a very sensationalist way, but what beyond that? So that's why I started going to a number of working class areas in Delhi, where I found out that there are a number of piece rate workers doing this stuff. And I had read about this almond workers strike in 2009 that happened in an area called Karawal Nagar in Northeast Delhi. So that's when I went to Karawal Nagar and I was introduced to Syeda, who was also part of that strike. So that's when I met her. And that's when the story unfolded. So initially, I was only asking very typical questions. What do you do? How much do you get paid? And then eventually you realize, she said, yeah, I came from Banaras. And then I said, oh, what did you do in Banaras? She said, I was a weaver. And then 8-9 months later, you realize, why did she actually come? So there are all these things that came in all sorts of orders. So after 4 years of collecting information in 2018, I realized, okay, when I start organizing this has many parallels with the history of India in the last 30 years. So that's why it happened.
Well, two things you brought up here, Neha. One is the backstory of the family coming from Banaras. The family wove Banarasi saris. Her husband could have done that. He was a master weaver of sorts. Yeah. Instead, he ends up being this cart puller and porter and alcoholic. I mean, with pop psychology, as a layperson, we could say those things are not unrelated. That's what he became. And he said their looms were literally burnt. Can you just explain why did that happen?
So I mentioned in the book also, Banaras, of course, has been very syncretic in many, many ways. Across the country, a lot of businesses, including Banarsi weaving, has Hindus and Muslims who are integral part of it. They can't survive without each other. A lot of weaving work was initially done by the Muslims, and the traders were essentially Hindus. It has changed over the years, but essentially that is how it was. Syeda, who was part of the weaving family, and Akmal, her husband, who was, such a specialized weaver that, he would make it a point that he would even, dye the yarn himself because he was so particular. And after the Babri Masjid demolition, there were many attempts to instigate riots across the country. There was a Sufi shrine where Syeda and Akmal lived in Banaras in a place called Lota. And after the demolition, some time later, is when that Sufi shrine was attacked and it was broken. And, these stories continue, and that's why I'm talking about it, because it happened in the 2020 riots also. Sufi shrines, which are not liked by Hindu fundamentalists, but also not liked by Islamic fundamentalists, right? Because it promotes syncretism. And overnight, when this Sufi shrine was broken down, some part of it, it became a Muslim shrine. And because these shrines are also important for migrant workers, like in the book also Akmal says, but later on many people have said this to me in the course of reporting, that when you move from one place to the other and you have no anchor, these are the shrines where you actually go and sit for a long time, find some kind of peace, solace, anchor. And so Akmal had moved from a place called Chandauli, which is now a separate district, and earlier it was part of Varanasi. He had moved to Banaras, and so he felt out of place, so he was very close to the shrine. Similarly, Syeda. And when Akmal heard that the shrine has been attacked, he just mindlessly wandered off, and he was sitting near the shrine, is when a lot of PAC and other troops came and started doing what they call talashi. So they started searching people's houses. and Akmal's house was also searched because somebody tipped them off. And while during the search is when PSC did a lot of destruction across the weaving community in Lota, broke their houses. And when the PSC came, of course, there was a lot of destruction. There was a random use of fire and carelessness. And that's when their loom was burned down. And Akmal, because he was wandering off near the shrine, is when he had to run away. He had to hide. And without any reason, mostly he was scared and underconfident, and that's why it happened. And eventually he was taken into custody and faced a lot of torture.
So, these are stories that you've had to report again and again when riots happen and things like that. And when you were talking about your initial conversations with Syeda, and how you asked the typical questions, how much did you earn, etc., did you sort of have to untrain yourself? Because I think as journalists, we are taught to break stories into binaries: Hindu, Muslim, riot story, Hindu, Muslim, rape story, male, female, labor story, factory worker, home worker. But Syeda is all of these.
I think, Sandeep, for me, I also realized like I said, at that point, I realized the limited sort of reporting that I did. And I was also looking at how everybody was talking about intersections and intersectionality. And so there was also an attempt, a deliberate attempt at my part to change how I was reporting. So, which is why when I was started talking to Syeda, I already had in my mind that I don't want to just talk about, for the lack of a better word, very typical gender issues, but I also wanted to talk about labor. I also wanted to look at migration. I definitely wanted to look at urban poverty, which in a place like Delhi, it's always hidden. You see these fancy neighborhoods and then you see one hidden neighborhood just next to it, which actually enables and services these places, but it's never talked about. So all these urban poverty, migration, labor, gender in some way, informal sector is something that I was looking at. But then Syeda did not happen deliberately. I was not essentially, because I was so tired of reporting on riots that I wanted to do something else. But for some reason, when I started talking to Syeda, one realized that, okay, I didn't even expect that this is the reason why somebody has migrated, but this is why it happened. The unfortunate bit of it was that I wrote the proposal in 2017. It was a lot of things were not part of my book. But while I was writing it, and of course, I was not productive and efficient enough to finish it on time, so which is why it dragged. But by 2020, when she was again affected in the 2020 riots, it was really unfortunate that it also became part of my book, and something that I was trying to avoid again became part of the story I was doing. So it all these layers overlapped, and one understood how a lot of not just life, but the socio-economic history of our times has all these intersections, and it has to be told more and more together than separately in boxes.
In fact, while you talked about Banaras's syncretic culture, we shouldn't over-romanticize that into a sort of Hindu-Muslim harmonious coexistence, right? You have these stories in your book about even when people were getting along, there was that separate plate or the separate glass for the Muslim visitor. And on the flip side, Syeda also expresses her own reservations about other people, including other Muslims, like, oh, this person might be Bangladeshi as opposed to Bengali and all of that. But do you think that the events over the last, the events that propelled the family to Delhi, then what happened in 2020, has made someone like her more aware of herself as a Muslim now?
So thank you for asking that question. I would say, yes, there was syncretism, but also at the same time, like you correctly said, let's not romanticize it. Mostly there has been coexistence. Right? In some places, the degrees of that coexistence and the harmony is greater, but mostly it's coexistence. And for Syeda also, what is very important is that initially, like she told me that before the destruction of her loom, she had faced everything except the attack because of her identity. That's the first time she was familiarized with the fact that, okay, this could also be the reason why you're attacked. In 2020, and then from 1990s to the 2021, again, when she's affected because of her Muslim identity, her children have been affected by their Muslim identity. But interesting that Syeda once told me that, I don't wake up every day to think of how to defeat the Hindu supremacists. I think of how to buy food for that day and how to survive that day. And again in my interactions, yes, she's more aware. Yes, she was not so religious, she's become more religious. But at the same time, for her, the primary identity to, live with and to negotiate life with is her identity as a worker and as an urban poor woman in India. That is what her struggle is every day. So for her, how she has viewed it, because even in the Shazeb case where he's a Muslim man and in love with a Hindu woman, he's attacked. Even in all these situations, she thinks that had she had more money, had she had more resources, she would have been able to navigate those problems. So, yes, I would say that she's more aware, she's more religious, but again, her challenges as a worker take precedence over her challenges as a Muslim woman.
Is that why, Neha, she is mystified or even a little irritated by the fact that you are very curious about her making incense sticks out of gomutra, which I would be also fascinated by, right? This Muslim woman is making gomutra, using gomutra to make incense stick. But for her, it's the same as making footballs.
Yeah, in fact, in those days, she made more money than the other things that she was doing. So she got really irritated because once she said, I used to make these incense sticks, agarbattis. And I said, what was the name of that agarbatti? And then she said that it's called Nandini agarbatti. And when I looked at the posters of Nandini, it had like a cow and the horns had like these gold ornaments over it. So that was the picture, that was the packaging. And then I said, what is this? And then she said, no, Gaumatra comes and we collect it and then we dry it and then dehydrate it, whatever, do all that. And then I said, can you tell me how did you make it? And she said, I am telling you about how to weave Banarsi sari and you are interested in making agarbatti. So she was also like, who's this person? She has no brains or something. But yes, as a storyteller or as a person reporting this story, the things I was interested in were of not any significance for Syeda. So even during like GST or demonetization, when a lot of home-based workers were affected, I've literally seen people cooking only once a day so that they can save on fuel. Or in the last 9 years, I've seen that how initially when I used to go to a lot of these areas where the workers live, in the evening they would do like a tadka and make potato curry and have that as a meal. I have literally seen now people doing a tadka in water, and when they give that bowl to a child is when they put few drops of oil because edible oil is so expensive. So this has changed. But when I try to talk about it to Syeda about GST demonetization, yes, she says Sarkar is like this, government is like this. No, government has been on her side, regardless of the political party. So we also have to understand it in that way. So yes, the violence has come because of a certain political party. But as a worker, to be able to buy food, to be able to get a proper house for rent or whatever, no government has been on her side. And that's where she has negotiated with the local legislator of a party that may not be supporting her in principle, but supporting her on the ground. So there are all these negotiations that have worked for her.
Yeah, that's really interesting because while I was reading it, I was thinking someone could twist this story and make it this great Indian unity in diversity story. Look, this Muslim woman is making gomutra incense sticks, rakhis, karva chauth, paraphernalia. But she's not doing it for any cause of unity and diversity. She's just doing it because that's what business requires at that time. That's the thing she can make. It's a labor story.
It was really funny. She said that when I came to Chandni Chowk and I met this Jewish woman, and I remembered how everybody said, you don't trust Jewish women or whatever. But I said, okay, let me just start washing her clothes to make some money to survive. So it was always that to precedence. Survival was the precedence than, thinking about your identity and because a lot of people, again, coming to what you're saying, a lot of times, if people are always engaged in thinking about how to survive that day, where is the space or the time or the scope to think about your larger political ideologies? Or even if you have one, can you afford to stick to it is a question that we need to think about. And which is why I often feel that increasingly all conversations about, pluralism or conversations about unity have to take into account the fact that people from various socioeconomic margins, their stories are also weaved into it. Otherwise, it could just be, like you say, an empty elite discourse about how everybody should be united. But that's not really the case on the ground.
So, how did someone like Saida, who is like desperately trying to hold on to jobs, sometimes the rates are going down, how did she get involved in a strike, the almond workers' strike, which is what first drew you to this?
Uh, so Saida moved to Delhi in 1995, and she was initially in Chandni Chowk. Then she was in a place called Sabhapur, which is a village half in Delhi and half in UP. And then she moved to Karawal Nagar in 2000. By the time she had moved to Karawal Nagar and worked there, and I mentioned this in the book also, like all joy and all possibility of, to be able to laugh at life or to be able to enjoy whatever is happening around you had sort of dried off. And she mentions it herself that earlier she was known to be a very talkative person, a chatterbox, and now just she didn't like to talk to anyone. And that is a point where she found a space in the house of a person called Nisha Radiowali, where Nisha Radiowali, because she had more money and more resources and more freedom because she was a single woman, is where all the women used to come and hang out and do an adda sort of a thing, or just take a break, or to be able to get a 20-minute nap because at home you were not able to do that. And Saida also started doing that. It's this place, for the first time since she moved to Delhi, is where she found a place where there was some sense of safety, there was some sense of emotional safety, there was solidarity, there was some care also, where somebody would ask you, have you eaten or not eaten, something as simple as that. And that's the place where it kind of coincided with the fact that the Unorganized Social Security Act was passed in 2008. And a lot of people, activists who were working with the workers, started looking to form unions of the people who work in the unorganized sector. That's when some people from Bigul Mazdoor Dasta started coming, and they found these set of women who used to hang out here and were working in the almond factories. Now, let me explain. When I say factory, it's the factory is a term that the workers use for their workspace. But technically, it's not a factory. Technically, it's a sweatshop. Mostly for like almond factories, they are in the basement of some house, or they are on the ground floor of some house, because the almond dust leads to a lot of health issues, which is why this work is done surreptitiously. So most of the time they don't have doors, and they have very odd timings, so that the work gets done by midday so that nobody gets to know what is happening. So in these factories, there's one window which you use to enter, and you enter at 2 a.m. and you can only come out 2 p.m., 12 hours later. And in those 12 hours, you have to break the shells of the almonds using your bare hands, sometimes soaking them in acid, because the challenge is to keep the seed as a whole. It should not break. And where do these almonds come from? Sorry, I'm taking a little longer to explain. But these almonds, all of them are the California almonds that are brought here. The shell is broken, packaged, again it is sent back. So for this work, a supplier in Chandni Chowk who exports it back gets 1,700 rupees for a 23 kg bag. The women get 40 rupees to clean that 23 kg bag. That too, it takes 12 hours. That too, with the help of at least one more son or daughter from the family. Mostly it's the daughter. So this is what, in the winters, this is what the home-based workers do. And so around the time the Bigul Dasta people came, all the women were doing this work. And so they formed a Badam Mazdoor Union. And that's when they decided, the activists told them that, okay, you should get paid more, you should have decent working conditions. So a lot of these things, Saida and many other people like, why? I don't need a toilet. I mean, the factory owner does not have a toilet at home. How can they give us a toilet? So it was mostly some demands which are actually legit, but this seemed like useless to Saida and many other people. But the fact that, you are getting paid 40 rupees to clean a 23 kg bag, you should get 60 rupees. Or the fact that you are locked up in a factory, you can't breathe, or the fact that you have to use your hands. So there was a joke amongst all the women that almond factories teach women how to eat with spoons, because when you use acid to break it, your fingertips are injured and they go off for a toss. That's when the activists started working, and they realized, okay, all of this is happening. And because all the women were together at one place. Now, why I keep talking about why all the women at one place was important is because it's very difficult to unionize home-based workers, because everybody is making a different thing and getting paid different wages. I am making footballs at my house, my neighbor is making peace trainers, and the next door neighbor is packaging, putting bindis. So to get the workers at one place is important, and that's why they were able to unionize it. And so in 2009, they finally managed to demand more money. The strike lasted for 2-3 weeks. There was a lot of violence. A lot of women came out and participated. That was also a time that Syeda said this was the first Mela I attended because, other than that, there was no scope to go outside that Northeast Delhi home-based work. So eventually, by the end of 2009, end of December, is when they managed to raise the money. Also because when the factory workers tried to engage other home-based workers, they were not skilled enough to keep the seed as a whole. And so why I talk about this is because our understanding of what is skilled labor and what is unskilled labor is also something that we need to start questioning,
Absolutely.
right? And so they eventually said, okay, not 60 rupees, but we'll give you 50 rupees per bag. And some other conditions were accepted. This also increased the global rates for almonds because this is holiday season, December, New Year, every confectionery all over the world requires that. And the interesting thing was, Saida's daughter Reshma, she sort of taunted and said, oh, you only got a raise for 10 rupees. For 10 rupees, you did all this. So obviously, Saida snapped back and said, oh, this is going to help me buy groceries for so many days, this 10 rupee raise. But she also said that for the first time, we asked for something and somebody heard us and did made a little change, which has not happened in my life. So that was interesting.
Which is sort of a small happy ending to that, a 10 rupee happy ending maybe. But do you think that percolated into her life later on, that experience of standing up, asking for something, did it have reverberations later?
So, no and yes. No, because within few years, they were back to doing the same work in the same conditions, and the money again was abysmal. They were not able to sustain their union for all possible reasons. Yes, because Saida was no longer scared to go to the police station or to kick up a fuss or to do whatever adequately needed to be done at that moment. For example, when Shahzeb, her son, was caught, or her other son Salman, who was quote-unquote a history cheater according to the police and was very frequently detained. She knew that she could enter the police station without being scared and kick a fuss and threaten them by telling them, oh, I'm going to call this human rights activist and you dare do that. And so in some ways, of course, that experience enabled her to be more confident and to be able to deal with the system around her better. Even with her position from the socioeconomic margins, from being a Muslim woman, from being a poor woman to being a migrant woman, that sort of gave her more confidence to deal with her situations.
Did you yourself get drawn into the story? Like, would she come to you as someone who has experience in dealing with the system, cops, whatever, and ask for your advice? And, some people would say, oh, the truly objective chronicler shouldn't be involved in it. I don't know whether you faced that issue and how you dealt with it.
Honestly speaking, Sandeep, glad that you asked that, because if the person you've been meeting for, say, 6-7 years, suddenly their house has been burnt down in a riot, what will you say? You can't say, no, I am reporting this and I'm not going to help you, right? Or if somebody dies in their family by falling in a lift chamber and later on the mosque falls on them, their son dies, what are you going to do? So for me, then as a human being, it's not possible to not be involved. And so I have been involved. But at the same time, as somebody writing her Saida's story, I have also tried to not glorify her, and whatever quirks like all of us have, or whatever demerits or frailties we have, I have included them in the story. But it can be called whatever, I don't know. But for me, the most ethical part of this relationship is the fact that if something's happening to a person who has given me her time and space and everything, then I will do whatever needs to be done.
When you talk about not glorifying her, Neha, one of the things where it comes through most clearly is the way she deals with her children. And if I was doing the sort of soap opera version of Saida's story, it would be like this mother who is harsh in order to be kind, because ultimately she wants the children to become whatever, doctors, engineers, lawyers. Here you see the case of the mother who surely wants a better life for her children, but also cannot resist dragging the children back into her life. So her daughter does well in school, but the mother keeps saying, will occasionally say, don't go to school today because we have these footballs to stitch and things like that. This is a world where kids are, putting iodex on bread to numb themselves so that they can work like robots. What did you learn about what it means to raise kids in this kind of environment?
Sandeep, I think for me, more and more after spending time and also having some time to think about it, the dysfunctionality of a family, whether it's an Indian family or wherever the family is in the world. The fact that even for Syeda, yes, she's a mother and she means well for her children, but that also has a lot to do with her own life and her own childhood traumas, right? And I'm not getting into pop psychology, but it has all these repercussions. The fact that you can only give care when you know what it means to be cared for. If you've not experienced care, how will you give care? If you've not experienced love in the way it needs to, then how are you going to give love? If you've not experienced kindness, how are you going to give that kindness? So it's not just limited to the family, but the outside world also. So the only way she knows how to behave with her daughter is be this strict person who does not have to give more. Or the fact that she does prefer her sons more than her daughter, despite the fact that the daughter is the one who's taking care of the entire family and actually doing it all by herself. So those prejudices are very much part of how we think. And it's high time we start acknowledging that these prejudices are there. The fact that your son, who you really like, loves another woman more than you. To have those boundaries, all these things are newer concepts. So you don't have that. And you're brought up with this thing, oh, I did so much for you as a mother. So how dare you, not be there for me? Or the daughter, of course, it's her job to be, doing the caregiving for us. So why is she asking for any acknowledgement? So all of those things are very much part of Syeda and very much part of me or anybody else who we know. And that's what I have tried to at least be honest about it. Yeah.
Did Syeda know that you ended up facing a lot of harassment and trolling for working on this story?
Yes, at one point, I was in 2020 for 5 months, I was physically stalked and I was getting phone calls from 200 numbers from the internet saying, you're standing in the balcony and we'll come and gag rape you. You bought this veggies in the market and we're going to come throw acid on you. So it went on for almost 5 months to a point where somebody tried to break into my house. And that day also I'd received a similar threat that they'll enter the house and gang rape and throw acid and attack my partner also. And they tried to break in, but they were unsuccessful. And later on, I went to the police and the police said that I was imagining it or something. So they totally dismissed what happened. And later on, I got CCTV cameras and all the things that you don't want to do in your life, you do. But I told Syeda, of course, even when I'm saying this, I am very privileged to be able to say that, right? And Syeda had faced worse than what I'm telling you about, because this is a point where her house was burned down in Karawal Nagar in 2020 riots and she had to move to another place called Nasbandi Colony. And probably I was being tracked because I was going to Karawal Nagar and Nasbandi Colony quite a bit. When I told Syeda, she said that Hathi apni chaal chalta rehta hai aur kutta bhokta rehta hai. Basically, the elephant keeps moving and the dog keeps barking. And that was her one-line response. And that's a very important response from a person who has faced so much. Tells you that just move on because there's no option but to move on. So that was her response.
But you've faced hostility, I'm sure, in your reporting before. But were you expecting at all this kind of hostility for a book that is, for the research that you were doing, which is not ostensibly, in a way, this goes to exactly what we were talking about, that you are trying to show a more complicated composite picture. But for some people, they will always break it down to that very binary that you're trying to get away from.
No, absolutely. Because for the longest time, I couldn't think of why they are saying, oh, you are reporting on this. Because 2018 is when I did my major investigation. And after that, 2019, I'd written some pieces, but they were not in a manner that should invite any kind of threat. I was constantly wrecking my brains over the fact that why am I getting these threats, to the point when we started tracing, okay, what were my movements? And like you said, which is why in this book also, it's very tempting to see Syeda as a Muslim woman. who's faced so much. But that is not the only story, right? There are so many things that are happening. And anybody who is sectarian or communal or whatever would try to reduce it to the binaries. But anybody who's trying to fight this sectarianism or communalism can only win by looking at the plethora of things that are on the table and not just fall into the same pit. And I think that is the challenge for a lot of us to be able to stick to, which again, the mainstream media completely makes it impossible, right? Because we're always responding to the propaganda that is around us.
You say you overshot your deadline. It took you 9 years. And as you saw with 2020, the longer you were, should more things start happening in this person's life. What made you think that you had reached not the end of the story, but at least the end of the book?
Very unfortunate, but it's her life in a very unfortunate way in 2020 came back to the same situation which had sort of uprooted her from Banaras. I would say uprooted, but also at the same time, like Akmal, when you talk to him, he always says, I like Delhi more. When you talk to Syeda, she says, I like Delhi more. So even when you were uprooted because of this, the kind of space that she got or that she feels she got in a place like Delhi to be away from the family or the familiarity of Banaras, that in itself is so important. And then even in that space where she was feeling safe, she faced similar situations. So that's why I thought, okay, this is a point where one can stop and one can do at least try to analyze what these 30 years are, not just for her, but any other person who's dealt with these situations, even if that person is not Muslim, even if that person is not Dalit, even if that person is not Adivasi, or even if those people are all these three identities or more. These are the political or economic events or social events that have changed the character of how we think as a whole in this country.
So do you think in the time that you knew her, in the time that you've been hearing her story, listening to all those different jobs that she's done, I mean, the goal for her was always simple. Get food on the table, children get educated, basically what all of us want, a better life. Do you think her life has improved for the better? Or is she where she was or even gone back?
I can't say that. I don't know if it has become better or it has become worse, except the fact that she's still there doing her thing. So I can't say that. The fact that the place where she lives now in Nasbandi colony, I have been to many, many places that have no infrastructure and they are in a very bad state. But Nasbandi colony seems to be the worst of those places where you have to walk through this puddle and algae and water always across the year to be able to reach the settlement. Or the fact that every day she lives in a house that has seepage and has a 4-inch wall and all the houses have 4 inches wall. The fact that she has to live there, and in spite of that, she has never thought of going back to Benares. But at the same time, she can still go back and work in a Tronka city factory. And Akmal can find work as a cart rickshaw puller in an Almira factory. Or the fact that her daughter is also close by and doing her computer job and all of that. So it's very complex. One can't say worse or better, but she's still there and she very much exists. Is something that I think one needs to focus on. Yeah.
But when you spend 9 years with someone, do you worry about that? Where do you see her role in your life going forward now that the book is done?
I don't know if this is a politically correct thing to say because I don't know. But I think of her as a friend in many, many ways because I can share things with her and she can share things with her and we no longer need a reason to be able to pick up the phone and talk to each other or meet each other every once in a while. So that is how it has been, and not just with Syeda, which is why when everybody says that there has to be some distance from the source or whatever, for me, in these 17 years of reporting, it has not been possible.
And will you look at bicycle, a football, or even an almond the same way again? I just had almonds this morning, and I read the book. I was like, oh shit. Now I know the backstory of why my whole almonds have appeared in this packet.
No, but that's what is, the attempt is, I wish we can all start noticing whatever we are using, somebody is making it. Not in those factories that we see in films, and I don't even know if any films show any factories any longer. But anything that I'm using, if I'm using a cell phone, or if I'm using a water bottle, or if I'm using a calendar or this light in front of me, somebody is making it. And let's just start noticing it. I think that much is enough. We, all of us, can't do anything more, but at least let's just start putting faces to the things that we are using.
Neha Dixit, thank you so much for joining us, and you be careful.
Thank you so much. It was a lovely conversation. Thank you.
Award-winning independent journalist Neha Dixit is the author of The Many Lives of Syeda X, the story of an unknown Indian. You know where to find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. Happy New Year, and this is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.